See the house lights, the kitchen's fluorescent glare, the living room's soft yellow. The pantry has its own bulb and window. Edna St. Cloud goes from room to room, turning all of them on, not for safety and not because it's dark. The evening's ritual hasn't begun. It is the comfort of cause and effect, the flick of the switch, the reliable binary. She can't believe her luck. Tonight, the whole family will be together again.
Thanks for listening to Read Minnesota Books. I'm your host, Deborah Copperrood. Today's guest is Katherine Packert Burke, author of the literary thriller All Us Saints, published in May by Bloomsbury. The book has a blurb from one of my very favorite contemporary authors, Torrey Peters, which, if anyone is wondering if blurbs sell books, sometimes yes, they can. Katherine Packert Burke is a graduate of the Clarion Writers Workshop in San Diego and the MFA program at the University of Alabama. Her debut novel, Still Life, was published by W. W. Norton in 2024. She wrote for LitHub's Letters from Minnesota series earlier this year about the federal occupation of Minnesota. She has also written for Lux, Catapult, Electric Literature, Gulf Coast, and The Village Voice. Katherine, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. What is your connection to Minnesota?
Um, well, I moved here about 2 years ago with my fiance, who is a McAllister graduate, and so had lived here before. But my maternal grandfather also grew up in Minnesota. He was a Minnesota farm boy who later joined the Navy and lived in Texas and Louisiana, where my mother grew up. But I still have a bunch of family up here, actually. Funnily enough, the last name of the family that All Saints is about is St. Cloud, and St. Cloud is where I have a bunch of the Minnesota portion of my family. Not an intentional choice, but one that I had to point out.
Yeah, I wondered that when I was reading it. So I know publishing can take a long time. Did you write the book before you moved here, or were you working on it when you were living here?
Yes, I completed the first two drafts of it while I was still in Texas. And then actually, right after my first book came out, I moved here in summer 2024. My first book, Still Life, came out in September 2024. And sort of in order to deal with the anxiety that publishing a book produces, and also the occasional not so much like loneliness of book tour because I was largely staying with friends, but I guess the onslaught of book tour. I did like four more drafts of All Us Saints while I was promoting Still Life. So it was finished while I was living in Minnesota, but begun in Texas.
Got it. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Can you tell me more like a synopsis or a little bit more about All Us Saints?
For sure. So All Us Saints is it's about a family, the St. Cloud family, and there are four siblings: Edna, Roland, Calla, and James. And in May 1992, Roland stabs Edna and kills her three best friends. And it sort of becomes this tabloid fodder true crime story that then shapes the rest of the family's life. And so the book is set 19 and 20 years after those killings happened. And you sort of see that uh, Roland, the murderer, is held up in the public imagination as this kind of trans slasher character, a la Ed Gein, who did some killings in Wisconsin in the 50s and ultimately spawned Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs because of how his story was told. And there's a section in the middle where you get sort of more perspective on what was going on with with Roland, but I won't go into more detail about that right now.
Ooh, my feelings about Roland really changed throughout the book.
Yeah.
A lot, a lot. But I want to ask you about there's a video game called The Neighborhood that is integral to the book. At first, it sounds like a cozy sandbox kind of game, like The Sims or like Animal Crossing, but it takes a very
Mhm.
dark turn. I wonder if you are a gamer, was that inspired by any real video games?
Yeah, it was definitely inspired by, in part by like Stardew Valley, which I've spent a lot of time
Okay.
playing, and also by these other games. So Stardew Valley famously was made by like one guy. He did everything for it. And there are these other like sort of weirder sandbox games like Dwarf Fortress and Caves of Qud, spelled Qud, that are these games that were made by very, very small, very dedicated teams over long periods of time. And they're sort of built to let you do anything. And the book really circles around questions of representation. There's the how Roland is represented in the true crime book and like the film adaptation that comes out of that. Roland makes dolls. He hand carves dolls. His sister Edna is a photographer. Um, so there are all of these different kinds of ways of like representing the human, and the video game, The Neighborhood, occupies just like one of those slots. And so I wanted to think about like, okay, what is possible in a digital world, and in what ways exactly do the possibilities of that world matter? There's a really good book. I think it came out in the 90s. It's a sort of sociological study of this online platform in the 90s called Lambda Moo, uh, which was an early form of online like game space. And and people were able to create almost anything in that space because it was all text. So you just had to do sort of simple programming to be like, okay, there's a magic 8 ball here, and other people playing this game can come and interact with this magic 8 ball. But the book about this called My Tiny Life by Julian Dibble was spawned by an article, I think in the Village Voice, that was about somebody basically like harassing and assaulting women in Lambda Mu, and the
Mm.
feeling of that, the feeling of violation there, and the way that it reverberated out into real life. And so, like video games obviously are toys in a way, not to diminish the like artfulness of them, but it is, it's a form of playing, but it also has this like very real consequence for, or it can, like very real impact on the lives of the people playing them, and especially when it comes to online communities. So all of that sort of like coalesced into this fictional game, The Neighborhood.
Tell me more about creating the character of Roland St. Cloud, and if you had qualms about creating a trans villain.
So in terms of creating the character, the very first draft of the book, the middle section, there's like 30 or 40 pages that are narrated by Roland. And that section was really, really different. It was Roland was much more almost of like a Hannibal Lecter character. I don't mean to keep coming back to Silence of the Lambs, but I just reread the book, so it's on the brain. But this very kind of like I was thinking about Hannibal Lecter. I was thinking about Humbert Humbert in Lolita. Not great points of comparison for like a closeted trans character, but I wanted somebody who was very erudite and who sort of brought you onto his side through language and eloquence. But there was a level of um, like unapologetic, uh, just spite that was in his chapter there that I think was just too off-putting. And
Mm,
so when it came time to revise, um, I wanted to make something that was more easier to sympathize with, that was more sort of sprawling and impressionistic and covering the entirety of his life up until the killings. And I don't remember at what point I sort of knew what would happen. I don't want to spoil anything for the potential reader,
yeah.
but over time, you sort of start to understand, okay, here's sort of why these killings happened. Um, and and I think that's good, right? Like I do think I did always want him to be a character that you would sympathize with, but I also wanted there to be a little bit of complication there, a little bit of edge there. And I will say that he, he stabs four people, three of whom die. One of them, I think most people would agree deserves it. One of them, I think it's debatable, and two of them are just sort of incidentally there, and he stabs them anyway. And I, so it's not like he is this purely just character either. And that is the sort of thing that I worry some people, especially other trans people, will find upsetting because there is a fear that it buys into ideas of like anti-trans rhetoric. But I think that the most equal form of any kind of minority literature, whether that's translit or gaylit, or I'm not in a position to talk about like blacklit, Asian American lit, all of that. But I expect that people would agree there too. If we're truly like equal in creating art, we have to be able to write characters who are not just purely good, who are flawed and complicated and maybe do things that are objectively not what we think should happen, because otherwise we're stuck in this place of having to be having to be saints. The original title of the book that eventually was cut down was All Us Saints and Monsters,
Mm.
because there is this quality of both, both the saint and the monster, both the good and the evil in all of the characters, and Roland is no different. I'll say also that there are um arguably five trans characters in the book. I'm not going to say who because it's arguable, but there are trans people who are living happy lives as well as you know as well as Roland, who is not. So I do hope that it's balanced in its account of trans life.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. Because that was my immediate reaction when I started reading it. I was like, no, this can't be the villain.
Right, yeah,
The conservatives are going to eat this up. Even though, I mean, it is fiction. Like I realize that.
right, yeah. Yeah, it's you know, I think it's a risky thing to do, and I hope that people who read it understand what it's meant to convey.
Why 1992? What were you doing in 1992?
I was not born in 1992.
Okay.
It's actually funny that there's one character, Edna's daughter, Ren, who is born. It changed over the course of the book. I think she's born in 1996. Um, it doesn't change over the course of the book. It changed over the course of writing. And so it's funny. I'm actually the closest in age to her, even though she is like less of the focus than the siblings. 1992 was picked. in part because I wanted this to have happened in an era where um there was not as much acceptance.
Mhm.
The trans backlash, such as it is actually, fairly new. Like for a long time, nobody nobody was that bothered by trans people on like a national level, but on a much smaller level, I think, there were not a lot of options for trans people in the 90s in terms of like making a living. A lot of people would transition and then go stealth. So they would just like pretend they would, get all the surgeries, get all the hormones, and just like pretend to be like an ordinary cis person in order to blend into society. And so I did want there to be a sense of foreclosed future for Roland. Roland isn't even really aware of transness except
Mm.
through what ultimately like seeing Silence of the Lambs. Um, and also some other interactions, some brief interactions, but I did want there to be a sense of impossibility, um, and like, the difficulty of imagining a future for oneself, because I think that is often the circumstance that leads to taking extreme action. And I also wanted time to be able to pass and still be in an era that I know something about. So, 2011, 2012, around the time that I was finishing high school and entering college, was like an easier time to write about than if I had the killings be in like the 70s and then set the book in the 90s. Would have required like a lot more research and a lot more like, you know, I would have gotten a lot more things wrong than I think I have. The one thing I know I got wrong is that video rental stores were mostly shut down by 2011, 2012, and one of the characters, James, works at a video rental store. So that is a little ahistorical, but otherwise I think I did an okay job.
Yeah, I think so. So writing a plot-driven book means you often have to put your characters through a lot of trials, tough situations. How did you, and these folks go through horrible circumstances. How do you get into the headspace required to inflict so much pain on the characters?
I mean that's a great question, and I don't know that I have a great answer because I think that when I am just like locked in and writing, I am not even necessarily like thinking that much about
Hmm.
how it feels. I'm just like, getting the words down on the page. But there are two things that I will say, which is that I remember revising this in the only Airbnb I stayed in on my book tour for Still Life, which was like the most depressing Airbnb I've ever seen in Chicago. There were no windows, not just in the bedroom, but there were no windows in the entire thing. The bed was this like flimsy metal, like IKEA bed frame. There were like weird inspirational posters on the wall. And I remember like before my event that night, just like being in that room and like, ma making edits, like rewriting scenes and being like, oh God, like I'm really in it now. The other thing that I would do, especially in writing Roland section, was I would put on music um that just felt like the right mood for what I was writing about. So I listened to the Ethel Cain album Perverts a lot while I worked on it. And there's a band that a friend of mine turned me on to, which I think I've only listened to while writing this book. It's called Boren and Der Club of Gore or something. They're German. And that sort of sounds like it might be some like bizarre German metal. It's really just kind of like gothic, very atmospheric, as memory serves, piano-driven music. Um, but yeah, I do think that like environment and music are useful tools for getting in an appropriate headspace to have bad things happen.
Yeah. Do these albums have lyrics? Can you write when there's lyrics or is it instrumental?
I have historically written to music with lyrics. That's been less the case recently. A lot of the book was also written listening to the band Drive-By Truckers, who have not just lyrics, but like really good lyrics. But Perverts and Perverts is like light on the lyrics, or you can't even really understand them. And Borin and their Club of Gore is all instrumental. So I think that probably also helped me focus on, the thing that I was doing and really lean into the negative feelings.
Got it. Here's another writing process question. I want to ask you this because I felt like I could have read about this family in any kind of scenario. They were so interesting, super flawed, but also like very amusing, very Addams
Uh-huh.
family, like dark
Yeah.
and humorous. Do you start with creating the characters, or did you know like kind of the plot and scenario and then create the characters to fit what happens?
I knew the plot and scenario. I mean, the way this book really came about is it to anyone who's familiar with the movie, it's going to sound very silly because it's not a very good movie, but I watched the sort of Halloween sequel slash remake that came out in 2018. I watched it around 2021, and given that you said that you don't read a lot of scary stuff, I'm guessing you also don't watch a lot of scary movies, and so you probably haven't seen it.
No,
Um,
and in fact, you've mentioned Silence of the Lambs a couple times. Like I watched that at a sleepover when I was way too young,
oh boy, yeah,
like around 1992, coincidentally, and that was like the end of scary stuff for
yeah.
me.
I I I saw the American remake of The Grudge when I was way too young, and it put me off scary things for a long time. So those things can be powerful if they hit you
hmm
wrong. But the 2018 Halloween is like it's set 40 years after the events of the original Halloween. Jamie Lee Curtis reprises her role as Laurie Strode, who survived an attempt by Michael Myers to kill her. Anyway, in this movie, Michael Myers comes back 40 years later and tries to kill her again, and a bunch of other stuff happens. But I was watching it and I was thinking, okay, what would it be like if the murderer didn't come back? Like if you spent your whole life traumatized by this terrible thing, waiting, because she's in the movie, she's spent 40 years preparing for him to come back. She's like built this house that's like a fortress, and like raised her daughter to, know how to shoot and fight and all of this stuff. And I was like, what would it be like if the killer just never returned and you spent your whole life waiting for something bad to happen again and it didn't? And so the characters that like propped up that story changed over early attempts to start writing it. There was a time where, much like that Halloween, um, the focus was going to be on like a mother who this had happened to many years ago and her children, which there is still some element of that. But I found that it was easier to write about sibling relationships than to write about mother-child relationships. And so over time, it took a couple of tries to ultimately make it work. And I think that it was a matter of like finding the right characters to fulfill the scenario that I had in mind. Um, and so it was very much an iterative process there, and not at all one that began with characters, really just began with this like, kernel of an idea that easily could have fallen apart and not become anything. But because I kept I was just too intrigued by the idea, and so I just kept coming back to it, and then eventually it found its way into its current form.
Nice. What's more fun for you, coming up with that first idea and drafting it, or do you like, it sounds like you are very thorough reviser.
Yeah, I really love revising, and I think that I it's possible I'm making this up or misquoting. I think Jeff Vandermeer once said that like the only reason that he has the career that he has is because he's learned to love revision. And I've really learned to love it too. I think there's a lot of excitement in the early stages, but I also frequently find a lot of frustration in those early stages of trying to make something work, and especially if you know that it's not working. And revision is the place where you get to make it work. And I like that so much more.
Tell me, who is your favorite Minnesota writer?
I have two answers to this question. One is the short story writer Alice Storr, who actually, depending on when this episode drops, her debut collection, Again Harder, is probably out or about to come out. And then my second answer is the fiction writer and also songwriter Carter St. Hogan, who writes both like really amazing, sort of fabulous short stories and also really incredible country music, that was also an influence on this book.
Great. Those are good recommendations. Maybe I need to talk to the first author for the podcast if there's a new book
Yeah,
out.
yeah, I'm sure that she would love to chat.
Are you on social media? Where can folks follow you online?
Yes, I am on Twitter or X, if you call it X, at Kat P. Burke, just KatPBurke. And I actually just like 3 days ago, finally started a Substack after years of thinking about it and not doing it. So if you have any interest in hearing or reading what I have to say about books and music and film, that's ghostimage.substack.com.
I will link to all of those in the show notes. That was great. I loved your book. I am so happy to talk to you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
This week's recommendation is to leave a little positivity online. It would help this podcast out if you'll subscribe on Substack or if you listen on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating and a review. And that's it for this episode of Read Minnesota Books. Thanks for listening.